My name's Frank Hinton. I'm the president of the Australian Commercial and Entertainment Technology Association, the big body for the sector. We're here shooting episode 10 of the ACETA Archive of Excellence, and we're at the Lions Arts Factory in Adelaide, who we thank for making these fine facilities available. We also need to acknowledge our sponsor for this episode, another fine Australian production company, getting bigger, better by the day, Novotech. I wanted to tell you a little bit about the Archive of Excellence. It's not a Hall of Fame. The ACETA Archive of Excellence is more than that. It's about people who have not only exhibited extraordinary skills, but they've also been damn good citizens and real contributors to the industry. And I'm talking here about people who are generous, people who mentor and encourage people. They're not just takers, they're givers. And believe me, we have no better candidate. Would you please welcome Jon Lemon?
Thank you.
So Jon, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Could you tell us about your beginnings? You know, you were born and bred and raised in Adelaide?
Yep, absolutely. Yeah.
And you've ended up at the peak of live sound engineering. But how did it start?
Well, I probably have to sort of point out my age at this point. So, you know, it was,
if you don't mind.
Yeah, no, I was born in 56, so a baby boomer.
Yeah.
And I just got interested in, you know, the whole sort of rock and roll music thing when I was about 12 years old, and then sort of 13 and 14. And I was, you know, I was interested in playing music a bit by then as well, but listening to the radio all the time, having pictures of Bobby Gentry on my bedhead and things like that. My sister used to run a nightclub at the YMCA in Flinders Street called Snoopy's Hollow. And one Saturday night, my parents couldn't find, in those days, 14, they wanted you to have a babysitter. Couldn't find a babysitter, so they made my sister take me along to the YMCA, which she was really upset about. But the band playing that night was Doug Parkinson, actually. And during the afternoon, I was sitting there and they started loading in these big column things. And I was like, oh, wow, this is pretty cool. This is the PA. And it turned out that was a local guy, Trevor Marshall. Trevmar Sound was his company. And I volunteered to help, not knowing there was 2 flights of steel stairs up there, up the back of the hall. So anyway, I did it. Watched him set it up, and, you know, amp at the side and 2 columns. And the band blew me out. And that really started me down the path of, you know, getting involved with this and this industry. And I started working for him on weekends around Adelaide for a couple of years, really.
As a live sound guy, or
as a bit of muscle, I think.
Roadie?
No. Well, yeah, I mean, the live sound, I think we had, you know, Sony electric mics that would just plug into the Big Bertha amplifiers that had DIN plugs on them, and effectively, you know, you might have 4, 6 inputs, 1 tone control for the whole lot, and just a preamp.
Yeah.
And in school holidays, I'd work for him in his shop, you know. He would build those amplifiers after lecturing at the uni and all that kind of stuff. So,
and you were still going to school at this point?
I was still going to school, yeah. And then, you know, and I sort of kept doing that, getting into the scene of the 70s by then, you know, early 70s. And around, I guess, you know, by the time I was sort of 16 or so, around that time, I was having issues with my vision, and nobody really knew what it was. And, you know, I was sort of planning to go to law school, or something like that. And I got told one day in Adelaide on the corner of South Terrace and North Terrace and that old bank building there that, oh yeah, you're going to be profoundly blind by the time you're 21.
Wow.
And that was a bit of a shock to the system. And I thought, well, stuff this. I'm not going to go to law school, obviously. That's not going to happen. So I'll get into the sex, drugs and rock and roll thing, without the sex, it seemed. But, it all sort of launched from there. I sort of just got more and more interested in the music thing, really, and bands around town. And
So it's starting to take shape about this point in time, and
kind of. I mean, I was in a bit of a shock for a couple of years as well. And I think, I was still doing local gigs in those days. I think Revolver had started another company. Trevor was fading away a bit, and I was just working with individual small bands around the place. And somebody invited me up to Townsville. So I'm skipping forward a couple of years forward now. When I was around 19, I think, I went up there and went up to Port Douglas, Cairns, and kind of then realised actually I need to earn some money. So I just started working for local bands up there, doing, I think it was the Ivor somebody or other's circuit of, you go and play in a pub for a week and move on to the next pub or nightclub, and ended up working for a band called Heart and Soul, actually, who took me back down to Sydney. And I'd known quite a few guys like John Sweeney, and he was working for John Paul Young in those days, did some gigs for them. And that was about an 18-month period. And I came back to Adelaide, and actually on my 21st birthday, I met my wife, and her brother was playing in a band called Rum Jungle, and I started working for them. And I realised at that point, this is actually what I really want to do, rather than just kicking around a bit.
So you've made a decision, sound engineer?
Yeah,
Yeah.
that was what I wanted to do, yeah.
And so from there, did you find it easy to get work?
Well, Adelaide back then, so that was sort of around 77 by then. Adelaide was actually pretty fertile in terms of music. People could make a living in the pubs, playing the pubs a few nights a week. You got the money off of the door, and, I'd even get paid well. I sort of think with Rum Jungle, I got a pretty well an even cut after a short while. And, we'd do the Tivoli, Lord Melbourne. I had these sort of regular gigs, sort of 3 nights a week, 4 nights a week. And I did that for probably about 8 or 9 months, really got into it. And at one point, the Sports came over. They were just sort of kicking off and didn't have much money, so they split the band up between sort of a few different houses. And I lived in a house with a guy called James Black and JJ Hackett. Both, went on to sort of be well-known musicians. And we had a couple of the guys from the band stay with us, did 4 shows with them. A few days later, I got a call from Steve Cummins saying, hey, we'd really like you to come and do our sound. And we just packed up the car and moved to Melbourne, and that was it.
So the Sports would have been your first
proper band,
major...
yeah, that were really doing business in Australia.
Yeah.
And they used a company called Nova Sound.
Yeah.
You know those guys,
Yeah.
yeah. And that's really when so around that point, I really started to take it seriously. I saw it much more as a business and a future than anything else. Yeah.
Can you describe your PA system you were using at that particular point in time?
Yeah. I had so it was a 12-channel Nova Sound board.
Yeah.
I did the monitor with, I think, 2 aux sends on it. One for effects, and the other one was the foldback.
Yeah.
And we had a 4-way PA, so 1 W bin, 1 212 Roy box, a 90-degree JBL horn with a set of 2 JBL rings on top of it for tweeters, and Jimmy Mack had made the crossovers in those days. Yeah.
So that's 1977, a typical
that was
PA
77,
system.
Yeah.
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 So fairly soon, aside from evolving in the local scene, opportunities arose for you, and you relocated overseas, and that was in April 1984.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so I'd moved from Melbourne I can't remember actually, just, I ended up doing the sports thing for quite a while, probably a year. In those days, that's what you used to do, work for a band for a period of time, work for Stars for quite a while, doing their monitors, in between times, Billy Thorpe doing monitors. But then Eric Robinson from Jan's used to see me around the traps, and he said, why don't you come and work for me in Sydney? So I did that in around 1980, somewhere around there. And that led me into meeting a lot of international acts, because they did all the international acts then. They only had a couple of sound systems, but they were big. They could do, big things. So, and one of the last things I did for Jan's was I'd done 2 tours with John Williams and Sky.
Yeah.
And looking after babysitting the front of house guy. And he was going off to do ACDC, and they were going back to Europe to do a 9-week or 10-week tour. And a week or two after they'd left, I got a phone call saying, do you want to come to Europe and work for us for this 10-week tour? I asked Eric, and he was like, yeah, sure, why don't you go? And a couple of days before we left, we decided to, again, pack up and actually let's just go for it and see what happens in England.
Right. So you relocated in England as an opportunity, but a specific one being Sky.
Yeah, that's sort of what got me going. Because, in the times of working at Jan's in Sydney, I mean, I worked for, or looked after, babysat, people like Pete Granger from The Pretenders, or Jeff Hooper, who was doing Leo Sayer, Shakin' Steve, just loads of people. And that was the start of sort of realising, actually, you can network on a fairly wide scale as well. And we didn't have email then. I don't think I got my first Tandy 100 email computer till 1985, actually. But
and wasn't that an interesting time too, the early to mid 80s, because that's when your 4-ways and your double 4-ways started to morph into composite boxes for the first time.
Yeah.
And then distributors were born because of these sorts of products. And I'm thinking here of Mayer MSL3, Turbo Sound TMS3, which I'm involved in, and of course the Martin RS1200 by Dave Martin. And so those sort of speaker systems started to make the other stuff obsolete.
Correct.
They were good times, weren't they?
Yeah, they were. I mean, when I first moved to the UK, I did a lot of work for Concert Sound then, who were Dire Straits Company and The Pretenders and Leo Sayers. There were loads of people, but they used all the old Martin gear, so filler shaves and Martin horns and split bins, and we'd be doing big arenas, but we'd be flying them on 8-foot by 12-foot platforms, just strapped down so they didn't fall off and floating in the air, and they were just sort of pointing in a direction. And it was, I mean, even to me coming from Australia, that was kind of like pretty odd, because in Australia, we by that time were using, in the early 80s, S4s. And
Concorde boxes.
And Concords that Howard Page developed, which weighed a ton. You could probably only put 4, 6, 8 of them up, but it was the start of that flying thing. And then, of course, Turbo Sound just seemed to perfect it in the early 80s. With having really good rigging systems and being able to get, just a beautifully
a lot of thought put into it. You ended up with one massive act at that time. Massive on the Northern Hemisphere, perhaps not so much here, Level 42.
After about a year and a half of sort of doing bits and pieces with Concert Sound, and actually spending quite a bit of time with Shirley Bassey around then as well.
Right.
Which was good. But that was sort of doing, Albert Halls and, sort of gigs all over the place rather than sort of doing the touring I wanted to do. Got back from one of those, and Level 42 just had like a #1 album running in the family across Europe in '85, I think. And they were just coming back to England, setting up for doing, I think, like 24 nights at Wembley Arena, followed by 12 nights in Birmingham, and then back into Wembley Arena. They'd bought all their new front of house gear, because that sort of happened in those days. The guy doing the sound, bought a Pro 40 and lots of outboard gear, and I got tasked to babysit him, and it became clear really quickly he didn't know how to use this gear, so I was helping him do all of that. And about 3 shows into Wembley, I got called into the dressing room by Mark King, the bass player, and he was like, "How's it going out there?" And I go, "Yeah, it's good, great. I'm being loyal to my guy," kind of thing. Conversation went back and forth, and he goes, "So I just want you to tell me the absolute truth here. How does it sound out the front? I'm never going to get back to the guy, but we're thinking of changing him. We're thinking of using you." And I'm kind of like, "Look, I couldn't do that. That would be the wrong thing to do." And he goes, "Well, we keep hearing you're really good, and you've mixed a lot of bands and blah blah blah. So tomorrow we're going to start sound check at 2:00. Can you be here then?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And he said, "There's a taxi waiting for you out the back. Just leave now, and we'll do the rest." And that's kicked off this sort of really my sort of international career. And I worked with them for quite a few years, doing all sorts of shows.
Musically, that probably would have been pretty satisfactory too for you, would it?
It was, yeah. I mean, because it was very much about the audio. So. Even though, and we were still using Martin systems, and I pushed them in actually onto EAW in the later 80s, because they would not buy turbo sound boxes, funnily enough. But they were known to audiophiles as, the band to sort of go and see. So we'd go into, if we'd do Earl's Court or something like that, they'd spend the money to... I was able to drape the ceiling through, or if we did another 10 nights at Wembley Arena, there's a swimming pool under there. I could baffle all of that, which ended up becoming a permanent fixture. Actually, funnily enough, thinking about that, still is at Wembley Arena, but must be fairly rat infested down there, or moth eaten by now. But anyway, that they were considerate about the audio, and that really helped me sort of get affiliations with, Brooks Iron Systems, and I do a lot of testing stuff for them in a live situation, just trying to advance things,
Right. Had you arrived at a point as you're moving into the 1990s, had you arrived at a point where you were pretty in demand as a live sound engineer?
Where I was, what, sorry?
You were very in demand at this point, were you?
Yeah, I sort of was. It was kind of weird. I think, and a lot of that, I'm not convinced it was just all about, the sound. I also had the work ethic, coming from this country where you do everything about basically in the sort of 70s and 80s.
Yeah.
All day and then drive the truck and, move on to the next place kind of thing. So,
yeah.
So I'd work hard, but bands used to also employ you sort of for big chunks, a year at a time, or, then retain you. But I was starting to realise I didn't want to be one of those guys who was with Queen forever, or, in my case, Level 42 forever. I wanted to do different things. And I kept getting offers for things. And also, I was kind of a little annoyed Concert Sound. They didn't really have the money to sort of move forward into a better sound systems in reality. And I did a couple of different jobs, like for a while, and we were using Martin audio for them, and in America, and that was when they sort of kicked off, when Johnny Marr was in the band and Jane Zeller, and that was sort of quite a big solid tour. We came here, as well. And then I went straight from that, did some more Level 42, then went on to Sinead O'Connor. Sort of got hunted down by her because she'd seen some of the gigs, and she just released the Nothing Compares album. You know, was I interested in going off and doing that? And I thought, yeah, why not? You know, and it looked like we were going to use Britannia Row, TMS3s, which that went horribly wrong at the last minute. Not their fault, it was a production guy's fault. But that was a pretty amazing tour and sort of, you know, terrific. And sort of off the back of those things in the 80s, you know, then I was starting to be offered The Cure and Pet Shop Boys, Depeche Mode, you know, it just sort of went on and on through the 90s. But that late 90s period was when I got involved with Brit Row, and then very involved with Turbo Sound, with the Flashlight sound system in the 90s, which was really, you know, the first of the lightweight PAs that you could put up like a golf ball, incredible rigging, etc. Really, you know, high-powered BSS amps.
Possibly the peak, don't you think, at that period of time?
Yeah, without
in
a
PA,
doubt. Yeah, hands down. I remember doing the first show in Belgium with Pet Shop Boys. We'd done about a month's rehearsal at Docklands Arena, and I'm pretty sure at that point at Docklands we only had 12 front-facing boxes, and they were building hard to get me another 6 for the sides to, you know, make the sort of 18. And I think 12 subs, and again they were building them because they had a 21-inch speaker and they couldn't even make the magnets big enough. You know, there were 2 halves in those days. There was nowhere in the world that could make them big enough. And I remember, you know, one evening sort of standing out the front, and I'd recorded a bunch of stuff on DA-88, so I think I was just playing it back, and Neil Tennant and Chris Lowe standing out there kind of going, wow, this sounds pretty incredible, doesn't it? And I was sort of like, yeah, it does. You know, it didn't feel like me. It was just like this whole different era of PA in front of me, you know, time-aligned PA, and that was sort of pretty amazing.
Yeah.
And then when we did the first show in Brussels and had the full PA, and I just kept seeing everybody from the music industry coming to their shows on that the following few months, you know, from PA designers to, you know, famous artists and whatnot. Yeah. So
in the 90s, what are we talking here, the sort of acts you worked with in the 90s?
So then I went back to The Cure. I'd sort of been friends with The Cure. I did their first tour in Australia in 1980 or 81, I think, and I kind of remained friends with them. And so I think I did Pet Shop Boys across 1991, and then 91 sometime I got asked, you know, look, will you come do The Cure? They're peaking at the moment. They'll do stadiums in America. You know, they were just huge. So, of course I said yes to that. And it was with Brit Row, and, you know, we developed the whole Flashlight thing sort of more and more, you know, with John and Tony, obviously, but, you know, having that live experience with it. We got much better at it, get underhungs, you know, sort of built for it, and worked out the subs a lot better. Everything about it sort of got better and better and better. And I ended up doing, I think, a year and a half with them at that point, 91 into 92. And then at that point I got asked to do Depeche Mode for another 2 years straight after that. During that point, and that's when I first started having a bit of involvement. Pink Floyd asked me to do their upcoming tour, which I think was 95, but I couldn't do it because I out of loyalty, I'd already said yes to another 8 months of Depeche Mode that they hadn't announced at that point. You know, I just, you know, one of those guys, if you say you're going to do something, you do it. So I carried on with them, but it did, you know, management said to me, well, the next time we go out, you'll do it, won't you? And they didn't do anything for 9 years after that. But anyway, until 2005, when they got back together again for the Live 8 thing in Hyde Park. And I
Okay.
got the call for that then, yeah.
So we've now moved into the 2000s, and I guess we're also, PA-wise, we're moving into the era of line array. But
Yeah, pretty well. It did actually. I mean, some of that was starting though, because I first met Christian Hire with Mike Lowe from Brit Row. I was doing a band called The Verve around 98, I think. Did them till they self-imploded for about 10 months. And then I did an Italian act called Zucchero, who's, really big kind of Italian bluesish guy. And we were doing an outdoor venue, and the Vidos had just been released. And they said, oh, we're going to have that. And we rolled up next to this lake, small stage and even smaller PA, 12 boxes. And I was just like, really? Okay, that's what we're using. Christian was there, and maybe even Florent then. And I set up my gear and, played some music through it. Oh, wow, okay, that's pretty good. Quite amazed. And band came, did their sound check, and that evening, a still night on the edge of the lake, no roof or anything. And I was like, wow, this is actually pretty impressive. So that was my first sort of, into the line array thing, really.
yeah, and so during the 2000s, who were your main clients in those days?
Doing quite a few different things, I think, but then I got involved with Beck in about 2001 till 2005, I suppose.
Right.
And he was having his big moment in the sun as well. So I did quite a few album tours with him, and musically that was great and good for me for working in America in reality, because he was based in LA. So that sort of started my movement into America, really.
And did you pick up on the earlier Pink Floyd stuff? Is this where you started?
Well, no, that really didn't. I mean, when I was in London, I'd do gigs for Brit Row, just where, occasionally sort of sitting in, if the Dave Gilmour, would do the odd show and all that kind of stuff. But really, no, it was during that sort of Beck period. And then at that point, also, I'll say, like around 2002, I think it was, or 2003 with Beck, the digital mixing thing was really starting to happen. Yeah. And I got involved with Digico very early. And I knew that was the direction things were going in. I mean, it was sort of obvious, Avid were going down that route. Bob Doyle had got a group of people together, left Midas, bought, God, I can't remember what the company name was before it was Digico. But they did, we're doing studio console. Yeah, it was Soundtracks, wasn't it? They had 2 D5s at that point, and Bob was saying, why don't you take one of them on the road? I'm like, oh, I'm not sure. And he said, Beck, it'd be good for that. And I spoke to Beck about it, and I said, look, I messed around with this thing. One, we can use the Pyramix recording system with it, so we can sort of record shows, I can play them back a bit. And 2, we can have snapshots, finally, live.
Yeah.
And your music changes so much. It means, we can really change the sound as we go and recall things. He was right into it. At that point, I'd sort of had neglected to say to him, but it might go horribly wrong too, which it did several times. But, in rehearsals, I'd mentioned that to him, and he was like, I'm into it. It doesn't bother me, If we have to stop for a minute or two while you reboot everything, I'm good with that. So, that sort of led me down helping those guys develop that console, and I've still to this day have a terrific relationship with them.
All the way along, what we're hearing, you've also had a great connection and relationship with our industry, entertainment technology. You've obviously had a lot of interest in the equipment, and contributed and consulted and all that sort of stuff.
Definitely. But I know there's a lot more intelligent people in this room and technically much smarter people than I am designing wise, etc. But, I was one of those people, I was at the coalface and I was the end user. So it just seemed sensible for me to be involved with people who were passionate, whether it was the speaker boxes, which was really, because we were still analog, and I was, involved with Midas as well, with the, going through the XL3 and the XL4, going out of the Pro 40 thing, I'd talk to those guys all the time. I had the first two XL3s on the road, actually, with Depeche Mode in '93. So I just used to love sitting to talking to people much smarter than I am about, this is my experience tonight in this gig, and this didn't work for me, that didn't work for me. Why is this button thumping when I press it, et cetera, et cetera. And they value people who would, at the end of the day, it made me look better because it would help them develop the next model, or, as we moved into software, the next versions,
Right. And at this particular point to change course, have you got any, you don't have to, have you got any comment about music then and music today?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I also, during when I worked for the Pet Shop Boys in the 1990s, they were the first people to really employ a lot of sort of MIDI stuff. I think the keyboard player, for example, had three, I think they were called DMP7s, Yamaha 8-channel mixers that you could recall settings on. So he was playing samplers back through those to me, but it had come to me like a band, but fairly balanced, And that was really interesting. It was kind of, and then there was only a percussionist, a guitar player, and the keyboard player, and then vocalist. And it was kind of weird not being with the drummer or whatnot, but it was kind of exciting because it was, times were changing, and that was kind of interesting. But then, and then I obviously, worked with bands with, proper musicians on stage and whatnot. But really, I think, by the time the sort of, race forward to those mid-2000s, and samplers and playback becoming, really much more regular sort of in pop, and it making it harder for musicians to really make a living by, really late 2000s. People were going on tour with, a bunch of samplers and a Pro Tools rig or a Performer rig and playing stuff back. And now that's become just, I was reading a review the other night, Madonna's first show at the O2 Arena, and caught my eye that they had to stop the show, something went wrong with the sound. And I thought, oh God, I wonder what they're using. This poor band and stuff. Then I read down into the article, there is no band. It was all playback anyway. So, something sort of went wrong, and that's just odd to me because she, with Level 42, we did her first stadium tour in America in 87, 88, Who's That Girl tour. And she just always had the best musicians and the best bands, So I get frustrated that pop has turned into that playback thing. And I've done it myself with Sia on her tour in 2016-17, and it was all playback, and slightly different because, what she was presenting was much more creative, and at least I got the time to get all the multi-tracks from everybody, set it up with the Pro Tools guy, so as if I had a band in front of me. That's sort of what came at me. And I, was given that luxury to do that, but still, it doesn't have the, you don't have that human element. I mean, that was a art performance, and I'll give her that for sure, because she'd always use bands, but I really miss that. It sort of drives me nuts when there's so much playback, and it's becoming much more common, even when you've got a bunch of musicians on stage. If there's a video around, and lighting, everybody wants to be on time code and program stuff, which in itself to me has been exciting along the way to just push the tech, but it's still better fun. Like last night, going to see Paul McCartney here in Adelaide, and I was sitting at the mixer with the guy who mixes that, who used to be my assistant in the 80s, you know. And we've been friends ever since. And I was just sitting there just thinking, how good is this band last night? It's just a different thing, you know.
Just backtrack a bit, because you work with Sia, and we must mention her because we're in her hometown as well.
I think we're right next to Sia Furler Lane, aren't we? It's just here somewhere.
Yeah. And so you're still her engineer?
But she hasn't worked for ages. I mean, I've known Sia since she was a baby.
Yeah.
Here in Adelaide.
Yeah.
In fact, her dad was in Rum Jungle, Phil Colson.
Oh, okay, right.
You know, and her mum we've known forever, Loeen, is here as well. But I'm still in touch with Sia. You know, I was on the weekend. You know, so, but you know, she's done so well. I think touring for her is like, well, I don't know. You know, she's about the only person I'd sort of get up and, you know. She's family, so I'd go out and do that again, but... Yeah.
So you've spent quite a lot of years leading up to now with Roger Waters.
Yeah, the last sort of 6 years.
You've done some fabulous things. I've listened to them.
Thanks.
Movies and stuff like that.
Yeah.
You know? Yeah.
No, it's all in with him, that's for sure. And done a couple of different shows for him now, tours for him. And they're interesting. And actually... You know, talking about sort of bands versus Pro Tools and all that kind of stuff. I mean, he's always been very cutting edge in technology. And when I took over, it actually, the guy before me, Trip Califf, you know, super famous engineer forever. He was all analog, but when I sort of came in, I was like, I sort of emulated what he was using. And then halfway through the tour, and not even halfway through, a third of the way through, I said to Roger, look, this is all theatrics. I mean, I'd met him back in 2005 and 2012 doing the Pink Floyd thing and stayed friendly with him. But I was like, you know, really, this should be digital. You know, you've got a break coming up for 3 weeks. I'd rather not go home and go back to Liddett's, to Claire's, and change over to a digital console.
Yeah.
But that was a big thing to do, and actually a much more modern PA, the new Claire Code 12 at that point.
Yeah.
From the older i5 that they'd always spec. And that was kind of a really interesting change, because it did immediately change everything, you know, and was fun to mix. But then this last that we did, we were in the round with surround sound. It was very complicated.
Was that the 2022 tour of America?
Yeah, in America. And coming out of COVID, everything was really difficult anyway. But, you know, it had been planned for a long time. It had got postponed because of COVID, etc. So it gave me more time to sort of work it out. And I actually did a setup in Sydney to see if it had all worked, where I, you know, divided the arena into quadrants, and actually we went back to quad sound for each.
And you did 50 dates, didn't you, on that tour? More than 50 dates.
It seemed like about 200, you know, because it was just never ending. It was like out of one gig into the next. It took a couple of days to load into each one.
But courtesy of that tour with Roger Waters in 2022 in America, John won the Parnelli Award as Best International Live Sound Engineer for 2022.
Yes, that. I did, yes.
So, the future. What's the future for Jon Lemon?
Not tour. I decided at the end of that tour, because Roger wasn't going to work this year, and I sat down with my, wife. We've been together since '77, and it was just coming towards the end of the tour this time last year, and we were sort of chatting about, what's next, and and it had been a tough year, and I just said, I really, the COVID experience, being at home, was the longest the two of us had been in a house together ever, for 19 months or something, and we didn't get divorced. So, we thought, well, maybe I can retire at some point and, just not do this constant travel thing. And we decided in Seattle that I'd retire. There's a few more weeks of the tour. I told the management, look, this is going to be my last tour. And they're like, fine, yeah, Roger's not going to do anything next year anyway. So I left there sort of, feeling really good. And a couple of weeks later, got a phone call saying, actually, Roger's thinking about working in Europe now next year. And
Another Roger Waters tour.
yeah, and I was
right.
just like, if I say yes to this, I'm going to just keep working. And I just thought it was only short. So I said, no, I know somebody would be good for doing it. I'm happy to hand everything over that I've got, etc. So that's taken me a while to get to a point that
Right.
that I'm at now, which is, I know I've got more to offer, and I for the last 3 years I've been the artist in residence at Adelaide Uni here at the C.F. Furler Institute, but of course COVID sort of got in the way of that. So I've really only ever done a couple of talks there and talked to people there a few times, and I'd like to do a bit more of that. And I've started actually with Novatech, starting to talk to groups of people down there, and I want to do more of that, and show people how to mix.
And there's always us at ACETA too.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah. So I want to get more involved with that because, I've always enjoyed taking people with me on a ride since the sort of latter part of the 80s. I was thinking of it last night watching Pablo Boothroyd, mixing Paul McCartney, and he does AC/DC as well. And he always acknowledges that, you're one of the people I learnt from. You're always great about explaining things. Another Australian, Dave Bracey, who does Adele now, and Robbie Williams, he was with me for years. Another young Australian who did all the Roger stuff with me, Dean Mizzy, who's off in America working for Claire's, and he's just gone into mixing. And, and there's been a lot of them, guy does the Foo Fighters, Anthony, and I've always enjoyed that part of it. So now I've sort of got more time to do that. That's sort of what I'll do. And I do it with a couple of people actually, just sort of off the record and don't make a big deal about it. But
yeah, well, that's why you're here, because you have that reputation as being generous with your time, and nothing's too much trouble. You're always willing to help and encourage people.
It's a team sport.
It's a team sport, and I guess I think we'd like to round it out, and I know everybody would like me to ask this question, but do you have any industry observations you wish to share?
Part of the worry of the from an engineering point of view, live engineering point of view, I've had a couple of worries for a few years, and I think COVID has sort of exacerbated them in a way. I do get frustrated with a lot of young engineers who come out of audio schools and have no practical knowledge, and expect that what they do with Logic Pro or Pro Tools in their bedrooms is going to transfer straight into live music, and they're not making enough practical steps actually out there in the world. And it's harder. I know it's harder because venues are different, and digitalization has sort of changed things, but all those basic things of gain structure, all that kind of stuff, you just see all that go out the window so often. Certainly speaker wise, it's easier for people, so there should be more knowledge in that basic training, and mix into a given audience rather than walking in. And I was at a gig down my way the other day to see Joe Camilleri play at the Big Easy Radio down in Port Wollonga, Aldinga down there, and a great little gig, half indoors, half outdoors. And I walked in and the opening act was on. It was so loud. It was one guy and an electric guitar, and I could not stand in there. No. Forced me to the bar, actually. But then when I came back to watch Joe Camilleri, and I knew most of the guys in the band, all my help, but the young guy, he wasn't that young, he was sort of late 30s mixing it. It was just fantastic. It was just so comfortable to be in there, and no ridiculously loud kick drum, and everything was just balanced really well. And that art seems to be, it's disappearing in a way.
It is, yeah.
You know?
Well, what advice would you have to a young person who came up to you and said, I'd like to be a live sound engineer?
I'd steer them towards McDonald's or something, you know, but I mean, really, some of the advice that I have is, you know, just go out there and do anything you're asked to do.
Yeah.
You know, knock on even if you're in Adelaide, knock on Novatech's door, just ask and keep pestering, you know, because they're going to work out that you're keen. Understand that, you know, diplomacy is a pretty good thing to have because you're working in teams all the time. You're working with people. And if you make it, you're going to go on the road. You're going to live with people 24 hours a day. So, you know, you've got to be able to get along with people as well, you know.
Yeah.
What's the old adage, you know, you've only got one chance, or you never get a second chance to make a first impression, you know.
No.
And really that's sort of my advice, you know. Go to the people, the professionals, and they'll help you. And most of them, if they're good at what they do, they're going to open their hearts and say, okay, this is my advice, you know, come in. You might have, I don't know, Laco or Ment can tell me if they get people to come and work for a bit of work experience for nothing. I don't know, but I used to do it, you know, I'd work for nothing just so I could learn the basic rules of what you do.
Well, it's that time we could go on, and there could be episode 11 or part 2. But anyway, thank you so much for. I think we hope that what we've done here, a lot more people out there in the Australian industry will know a lot more about you, because they should. And I'm sure this is an Adelaide. Predominantly an Adelaide audience, and I reckon they're awfully proud to call you their own.
Yeah,
and as is Australia, because you've achieved heaps.
Yeah.
And would you please thank Jon for being so generous with his time?
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks, Frank.
Pleasure.